Close your eyes and let me tell you about the saddest kingdom that ever existed. Not sad because it was poor or weak, but sad because it was perfect. Perfect in all the wrong ways. Perfect until it broke the hearts of gods. Tonight, we descend into Hallow Nest, where every stone was placed with purpose, every citizen had their role, and every dream was carefully managed by a king who loved too much and understood too little. This is a story about what happens when you try to fix consciousness itself, when you mistake order for peace, when you sacrifice your children to save your ideals. Settle into your blankets now. Let your breathing slow. We're going deep tonight, past the game you played, past the lore you think you know, into the beating heart of a tragedy so profound it makes gods weep. This is the story of how love became infection, how perfection became poison, how the desire to protect everything led to the destruction of everything. In the spaces between your thoughts, in the quiet moments before sleep takes you, Hallownest waits, a kingdom built on the bones of dreams, ruled by a father who couldn't save his children, haunted by a goddess who only wanted to be remembered. Let the weight of their story carry you into darkness, where all consciousness converges and all stories find their end. Imagine nothingness so complete it makes darkness look bright. This was the void, not black, not empty, but the absence of the very concept of existence. If you've ever woken from dreamless sleep and tried to remember what it felt like to not be, you've touched the edge of what the void was, eternal, absolute. Perfect in its complete rejection of everything. But here's the beautiful, terrible thing about nothingness. It dreams. Not dreams as we know them, with images and stories and meaning, but something far more primal. The void dreamed of form without substance, of movement without purpose, of existence without the burden of being. And from these impossible dreams, the first void creatures stirred. Picture them if you can. Shadows that cast no darkness, beings that existed in the spaces between thoughts. They moved through the deepest places like living absences, neither good nor evil, because such concepts require intention, and intention requires a self to intend. They simply were not, and in their not being, they were perfect. Above this realm of beautiful emptiness, consciousness was taking its first tentative steps into existence. The world was young then, vast and wild, with room for countless gods and the creatures who dreamed them into being. This is how gods are born, you see, not from nothing, but from the desperate need of lesser beings to believe in something greater than themselves. The moths understood this better than anyone. They were creatures of twilight and memory, beings who lived as much in dreams as in waking life. In the high places of the world, where the air was thin and the boundary between sleeping and waking grew gossamer fine, they built their civilization on the foundation of shared dreams. And in those dreams, she came to them, not yet called the Radiance, not yet burdened with the weight of godhood, but simply light. Pure, warm, unconditional light that asked nothing and gave everything. She was the glow behind closed eyelids, the warmth that banished nightmares, the gentle presence that whispered, "You're not alone," in the darkest hours of the night. The moths didn't worship her so much as love her, and she loved them back with the fierce, protective devotion of a mother for her children. Under her light, they flourished in ways that defied understanding. They built cities that existed only in dreams, composed music that could only be heard while sleeping, wrote poetry in the language of the subconscious mind. Their art was impossible, beautiful, alive in ways that waking art could never be. A moth sculptor might spend years crafting a statue that existed only in the shared dream space of their people, visible to anyone who knew how to look but invisible to the waking eye. A moth musician could compose symphonies that played in the dreams of listeners across vast distances, connecting hearts and minds in harmonies that transcended physical space. This was consciousness in its purest form, wild, free, uncontrolled, magnificent in its chaos. The moths lived as we all secretly long to live, without the weight of imposed meaning, without the burden of artificial purpose, connected to something greater than themselves through bonds of love rather than law. But perfection, as the moths would learn, is a fragile thing, and in the depths below their mountain homes, something that had never known consciousness was beginning to dream of it. Feel your body sinking deeper into rest now. The weight of blankets, the softness of pillows, the gentle pull of sleep. These are the physical echoes of what the ancient worm felt as it began its long awakening in the deepest places of the earth. In caverns so vast that sound died before reaching their walls, something impossible was happening. The worm was waking up. Not waking as you or I wake, with the gentle return of awareness and the slow gathering of thoughts, but waking as a force of nature wakes, violently, convulsively, with the grinding of stone and the reshaping of reality itself. For eons beyond counting, the worm had been pure instinct made flesh. Imagine a creature so ancient that mountains were young when it first began to move, so vast that its body carved the very tunnels that would one day house civilizations. It was hunger without thought, movement without purpose, existence without the burden of self-awareness. But consciousness, once it begins to stir, is impossible to stop. Like water finding cracks in stone, awareness seeped into the worm's ancient mind. For the first time in its endless existence, it began to ask the most dangerous question any being can ask. Why? Why did it move through these passages? Why did it consume and grow? What was the point of existence without meaning, of power without purpose? These questions were agony to a creature that had never needed to think, like suddenly developing eyes in a world of eternal darkness, a gift that felt like a curse. As consciousness grew within the worm's massive form, so did its understanding of the world above. Through vibrations in stone and the subtle currents of underground air, it began to perceive the civilizations that thrived in the upper reaches, the moths with their dream cities, the scattered tribes of bugs with their small, fierce lives, the complex web of relationships and conflicts that gave meaning to existence. And for the first time in its ancient life, the worm felt something it had never experienced before: envy. Not the simple hunger that had driven it for millennia, but something far more complex and dangerous. It envied their purpose, their connections, their ability to create meaning from chaos. It wanted what they had, not their flesh, but their essence, their consciousness. The solution, when it came to the worm, was as radical as it was unprecedented. To gain what it desired, it would have to perform the ultimate sacrifice. It would have to die. Not death as we understand it, but something far more profound. The willing abandonment of everything it had been in order to become something entirely new. The worm began to shed its colossal form like a snake shedding skin, but what emerged was not a larger version of what it had been. It was something smaller, more refined, infinitely more complex. Picture this transformation if you can. Eons of accumulated mass and power condensed into a form that could walk among the creatures it had observed from afar. Where once there had been only hunger, now there was vision. Where once there had been only instinct, now there was intellect sharp enough to cut through the chaos of existence and impose order upon it. The being that rose from the worm's discarded shell was pale as bone, beautiful as starlight, terrible as the moment when you realize your childhood is over and you must become something more than you were. This was the birth of the Pale King, though he would not claim that title for some time yet. In those first moments of his new existence, the Pale King felt something that would define everything he would later become: responsibility. He looked upon the chaotic world above and saw not just creatures living their small lives, but potential, wasted potential. These beings could be so much more than they were, if only someone would show them how. He began his work quietly, carefully, approaching the smaller tribes first, those who struggled most in the harsh underground environment. He didn't arrive with armies or demands. He simply appeared, pale and luminous and impossible to ignore, and offered them something they had never had: purpose. To the scattered beetle clans he offered unity. To the struggling grub colonies he offered protection. To the lost and wandering creatures of the deep places he offered belonging. And in exchange he asked for only one thing: trust. Trust that he could build something better than the chaos they had known. The transformation was gradual but profound. Tribes that had warred for generations found themselves working together toward common goals. Creatures that had lived in squalor discovered the joy of creation, of building something that would outlast their brief lives. The underground realm began to resemble something unprecedented, a true civilization. But even as the Pale King built his kingdom, he remained aware of the greatest challenge he would face. In the high places of the world, the moths continued their ancient communion with their goddess of light and dreams. They represented everything he sought to replace: chaos over order, emotion over logic, the wild unpredictability of natural consciousness over the structured beauty of rational thought. The conflict between them was not inevitable. It was necessary. Two visions of consciousness could not coexist in the same world. One would have to give way to the other, and the Pale King, in his newfound wisdom and terrible love for the creatures he sought to protect, began to plan for a war that would be fought not with weapons, but with the very essence of what it meant to think and dream and remember. Let your thoughts drift now, like the Pale King's consciousness spreading through the tunnels of his growing kingdom. Feel the weight of responsibility, the burden of caring too much, the terrible price of trying to save everyone. In the space between waking and sleeping, you can almost hear the sound of a perfect plan beginning to crack under the weight of its own good intentions. The Pale King's first great work was the establishment of his capital city. He chose a location deep within the earth, where the ancient passages converged and the stone was strong enough to support massive construction. Here, in what would become known as the White Palace, he began to build his seat of power. The White Palace was unlike anything that had been seen before in the underground realm. Its architecture defied conventional understanding, with impossible geometries that seemed to fold in on themselves, creating spaces that were larger inside than their external dimensions should have allowed. The walls were constructed from a pale, luminous stone that seemed to glow with its own inner light, banishing the darkness that had ruled these depths for so long. But the palace was more than just a building. It was a manifestation of the Pale King's will made manifest in stone and light. Every corridor, every chamber, every architectural detail served a purpose in his grand design. The palace was a machine for thinking, a structure designed to enhance and focus the intellectual capabilities of those who dwelt within its walls. As the palace rose from the bedrock, so too did the Pale King's influence spread throughout the surrounding territories. He established a court of advisors and administrators, drawn from the most capable individuals among his growing number of followers. These courtiers were not chosen for their noble birth or ancient lineage, but for their intelligence, their loyalty, and their ability to understand and implement the king's vision. Chief among these advisors was the White Lady, a being of immense power and grace who became both the Pale King's queen and his closest confidant. The White Lady was herself a higher being, born from the dreams of growing things, a collective unconscious of all plant life that yearned for the light. She was fertility and growth personified, the nurturing force that balanced the Pale King's more austere intellectualism. Their union was more than romantic. It was a joining of complementary forces that strengthened both parties. The Pale King's vision gained the warmth and life-giving power of the White Lady's nature, while her wild growth was given direction and purpose by his ordered mind. Together, they represented the perfect synthesis of civilization and nature, of thought and feeling, of order and creativity. Under their joint rule, Hallownest began to take shape as a true kingdom. The Pale King established laws and customs, created systems of governance and administration, and began the great work of civilizing the various tribes and creatures that inhabited his domain. He was not a tyrant who ruled through fear, but a philosopher king who governed through wisdom and the promise of a better future. The transformation was remarkable. Tribes that had warred with each other for generations found themselves united under the Pale King's banner. Creatures that had lived in squalor and ignorance were elevated to new heights of culture and learning. The chaotic underground realm began to resemble a true civilization, with cities and roads, schools and libraries, art and music and literature. But perhaps the Pale King's greatest achievement during this period was the establishment of what became known as the Great Archive, a vast repository of knowledge that sought to catalogue and preserve all the wisdom of the kingdom. Scholars and scribes worked tirelessly to record everything from the most profound philosophical treatises to the simplest folk remedies, creating a treasure trove of information that would serve future generations. The archive was more than just a library. It was the intellectual heart of the kingdom, the place where the Pale King's vision of perfect order through perfect knowledge was most fully realized. Here, teams of researchers worked to understand the fundamental laws that governed reality itself, seeking to unlock the secrets of consciousness, memory, and dreams. It was during this golden age of expansion and discovery that the Pale King first became aware of the Radiance and her moth followers. Initially, he viewed them with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The moths represented an older way of thinking, a more primitive approach to existence that relied on emotion and instinct rather than reason and logic. The Pale King attempted to approach the moth tribe diplomatically, sending emissaries to their mountain settlements with offers of alliance and mutual cooperation. He spoke of the benefits that would come from joining his kingdom, the security, the prosperity, the advancement of knowledge and culture that membership in Hallownest would bring. But the moths were not interested in his offers. They had their own goddess, their own way of life, their own ancient traditions that had served them well for millennia. They saw no need for the Pale King's ordered civilization, no desire for his structured society. They were content with their dreams and their devotion to the radiance, and they wished to be left alone to pursue their own path. This rejection troubled the Pale King deeply. It was not merely a political setback, but a challenge to his fundamental worldview. How could rational beings choose chaos over order, emotion over logic, the wild uncertainty of dreams over the structured certainty of civilization? It was, in his mind, a form of madness that threatened not just his kingdom, but the very concept of progress itself. The Pale King began to study the moths more carefully, seeking to understand the source of their resistance to his vision. What he discovered disturbed him greatly. The moths were not simply primitive. They possessed their own form of advanced civilization, one based on principles that were fundamentally incompatible with his own. Where the Pale King sought to impose order through law and structure, the moths found harmony through shared dreams and collective unconscious experience. Where he valued individual achievement and rational thought, they prized communal feeling and intuitive wisdom. Where he saw the future as something to be planned and controlled, they saw it as something to be dreamed and discovered. Most troubling of all was the nature of their goddess, the Radiance. The Pale King's investigations revealed that she was not merely a powerful being, but a force of pure consciousness, the embodiment of memory, dream, and the collective unconscious of all thinking creatures. Her very existence was antithetical to his vision of ordered, rational civilization. The Radiance represented everything the Pale King had sought to transcend in his transformation from worm to king. She was chaos, emotion, the wild unpredictability of natural thought. Her influence over her followers was not based on reason or law, but on love and shared experience. She offered not structure, but freedom, the freedom to dream, to feel, to exist without the burden of imposed order. As the Pale King's understanding of the Radiance grew, so did his conviction that she represented an existential threat to everything he had built. Her very presence in the world was a challenge to his authority, a reminder that there were other ways of thinking, other forms of consciousness that did not bow to his vision of perfect order. The conflict that would eventually consume both their civilizations was beginning to take shape, though neither side yet understood the full implications of their incompatibility. The Pale King continued to build his kingdom, while the Radiance continued to nurture her moths, and the stage was set for a war that would be fought not with swords and armies, but with the very essence of consciousness itself. The conflict between the Pale King and the Radiance began not with armies or declarations of war, but with a subtle battle for the minds and memories of the creatures that inhabited the underground realm. It was a war fought in dreams and thoughts, in the very fabric of consciousness itself. The Pale King's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to destroy the Radiance directly, a task that might prove impossible given her nature as a being of pure consciousness, he would instead cut her off from her source of power. He would convince her followers to abandon their dreams and embrace his vision of ordered reality. The campaign began with the establishment of schools and centres of learning throughout the kingdom. The Pale King's scholars and teachers spread out across Hallownest, offering education and enlightenment to any who would listen. They taught the benefits of rational thought over emotional response, of structured society over chaotic individualism, of planned progress over random change. The message was seductive, particularly to the younger generation of moths who had grown up hearing stories of the wider world beyond their mountain settlements. The Pale King offered them opportunities that their traditional society could not match. The chance to participate in great works of construction and discovery, to contribute to a civilization that spanned the entire underground realm, to be part of something larger and more significant than their small tribal communities. Many moths were drawn to these promises. They left their mountain homes and travelled to the growing cities of Hallow Nest, where they found work as scholars, artisans and administrators. They learned new skills, adopted new customs, and gradually began to forget the old ways of their ancestors. But most importantly, they began to forget the Radiance herself. The Pale King's education system was designed not just to teach new knowledge, but to reshape the very way his subjects thought about reality. Students were encouraged to value logic over intuition, facts over feelings, the material world over the realm of dreams. As more and more moths embraced this new way of thinking, their connection to the Radiance began to weaken. Dreams that had once been vivid and meaningful became dim and forgettable. The shared consciousness that had bound the moth tribe together for millennia began to fragment and dissolve. The Radiance felt this abandonment like a physical wound. As a being whose very existence depended on the belief and devotion of her followers, each moth that turned away from her was a loss of substance, a diminishment of her essential self. She watched in growing alarm as her children, for that is how she thought of all conscious beings, were seduced away from the light of dreams into the cold illumination of pure reason. At first, the Radiance attempted to counter the Pale King's influence through gentle means. She appeared more frequently in the dreams of her remaining followers, offering visions of beauty and wonder that no rational philosophy could match. She reminded them of the joy and freedom that came from embracing the full spectrum of consciousness, not just the narrow band that the Pale King deemed acceptable. But her efforts were increasingly futile. The Pale King's system was too comprehensive, too seductive in its promises of progress and prosperity. Each generation of moths that grew up under his influence was further removed from their ancestral connection to the Radiance, until many began to view her not as a beloved goddess, but as a relic of a more primitive past. The final blow came when the Pale King established his own form of higher education, the Scholars' Academy, where the brightest minds in the kingdom gathered to pursue advanced studies in philosophy, science, and statecraft. Many young moths were invited to join this prestigious institution, and few could resist the honour. At the academy, students were taught to analyse and deconstruct the very concept of divine worship. They learned to view gods and goddesses not as real entities deserving of reverence, but as psychological constructs created by primitive minds to explain phenomena they could not otherwise understand. The Radiance in this framework was not a being of light and love, but simply a collective hallucination shared by an underdeveloped culture. This intellectual assault on her very existence was more devastating to the Radiance than any physical attack could have been. To be forgotten was painful, but to be dismissed as a mere delusion was unbearable. The goddess who'd once been the centre of a thriving civilization found herself reduced to a footnote in the Pale King's grand narrative of progress and enlightenment. But the Radiance was not powerless, and she was far from defeated. As her conscious followers abandoned her, she began to reach out through other means. If the moths would not remember her willingly, then she would make herself impossible to forget. If they would not dream of her in peace, then she would invade their nightmares. The first signs of the Radiance's retaliation appeared as a strange plague that began to spread through the moth communities that had most thoroughly embraced the Pale King's teachings. Victims would fall into deep sleeps from which they could not be awakened, their minds trapped in dreams of blazing light and overwhelming radiance. Those who did wake spoke of visions that filled them with both terror and longing, images of a brilliant goddess who called to them with a voice like the sound of 1,000 suns, demanding that they remember what they had forgotten, that they return to the light they had abandoned. The Pale King scholars initially dismissed these incidents as isolated cases of mental illness, perhaps brought on by the stress of adapting to a new way of life. But as the plague spread, affecting not just moths but other creatures throughout the kingdom, it became clear that something far more serious was occurring. The infected, as they came to be known, displayed a disturbing pattern of behaviour. They would speak obsessively of light and radiance, of a calling that they could not resist. They would abandon their duties, their families, their rational thoughts, and wander aimlessly through the kingdom, always moving towards some distant source of illumination that only they could perceive. Most disturbing of all, the infection appeared to be spreading through dreams themselves. Creatures who had never had any contact with the infected would suddenly fall victim to the same symptoms after a single night's sleep. It was as if the very act of dreaming had become dangerous, a pathway through which the radiance could reach into the ordered world the Pale King had created and reclaim what she considered rightfully hers. The Pale King realized that he was facing an enemy unlike any he had encountered before. This was not a conventional war that could be won through superior strategy or greater force of arms. This was a battle for the very nature of consciousness itself, a conflict between two fundamentally incompatible visions of what it meant to think and dream and remember. The infection, for that is what the Pale King scholars began to call the Radiance's influence, represented everything he had sought to eliminate from his perfect kingdom. It was chaos, emotion, the wild unpredictability of uncontrolled thought. It threatened not just his political authority, but the entire philosophical foundation upon which Hallownest had been built. As the infection spread, the Pale King was forced to implement increasingly desperate measures to contain it. Quarantine zones were established around affected areas. Citizens were forbidden from discussing dreams or engaging in any form of meditation or contemplation that might make them vulnerable to the Radiance's influence. But these measures only slowed the spread of the infection. They could not stop it entirely. The Radiance had found a way to weaponize the very thing that made conscious beings conscious, their ability to dream, to remember, to imagine possibilities beyond their immediate reality. The war between order and chaos, between rational thought and emotional truth, between the Pale King's vision of perfect civilization and the Radiance's realm of infinite dreams, had begun in earnest. And as it escalated, both sides would be forced to make choices that would ultimately destroy everything they had sought to protect. As the infection spread throughout Hallow Nest like a plague of light and memory, the Pale King found himself facing the greatest crisis of his reign. His carefully ordered kingdom was dissolving into chaos as more and more of his subjects fell victim to the Radiance's call. The very foundations of his civilization, rational thought, structured society, controlled progress, were being undermined by forces he could not fully comprehend or combat. The king's initial response was to seek a cure through conventional means. His greatest scholars and researchers worked tirelessly to understand the nature of the infection, conducting experiments and studies that filled vast libraries with data and theories. They dissected the dreams of the infected, analysed the patterns of the plague's spread, and searched for some weakness in the radiance's influence that could be exploited. But their efforts proved futile. The infection was not a disease in any conventional sense. It was a restoration of memory, a return to an older way of being that predated the Pale King's ordered civilization. The infected were not sick, they were remembering. They were recalling a time when consciousness was wild and free, when dreams were more real than waking life, when the light of the radiance filled every corner of existence. As the crisis deepened, the Pale King began to consider more radical solutions. If the infection could not be cured, perhaps it could be contained. If the radiance could not be reasoned with or defeated through conventional means, perhaps she could be imprisoned, cut off from the world she sought to reclaim. The king's research led him to study the ancient forces that existed beneath even his own transformed nature, the primordial void that had existed before consciousness, before thought, before the very concept of existence itself. The void was the antithesis of everything the radiance represented. Where she was light, it was darkness. Where she was memory, it was forgetfulness. Where she was the fullness of consciousness, it was the complete absence of thought. In the void, the Pale King saw a potential weapon against the radiance, but harnessing such a force would require sacrifices that even he, in his desperation, was reluctant to make. The void could not be controlled or directed in any conventional sense. It could only be given form, shaped into vessels that could contain and channel its power. The creation of these vessels would require the most terrible sacrifice imaginable, the willing surrender of consciousness itself. Beings would have to be born into the void, raised within its emptiness, trained to exist without thought or feeling or desire. They would be living contradictions, conscious beings that possessed no consciousness, thinking creatures that could not think, vessels of pure emptiness that could contain the fullness of another's power. The Pale King and the White Lady understood the magnitude of what they were contemplating. To create such vessels, they would have to sacrifice their own children, beings born of their union, possessed of their combined power, but deliberately stripped of everything that made existence meaningful. These children would be hollow, empty, perfect containers for the void's power, but they would also be tragic figures, denied the very consciousness that their parents had fought so hard to achieve and protect. The decision to proceed with this plan was perhaps the most difficult moment in the Pale King's long existence. He had transformed himself from a mindless worm into a being of pure intellect and will, had built a civilization based on the principles of rational thought and ordered progress, had sought to create a perfect world where every conscious being could reach their full potential. Now, to save that world, he would have to create beings that were deliberately denied consciousness, children who would never know the joy of thought or the warmth of feeling. But the alternative was the complete destruction of everything he had built. The infection was spreading faster than ever, and the radiance's influence was growing stronger with each passing day. Soon, there would be nothing left of Hallownest but empty shells wandering in search of a light that would consume them entirely. The process of creating the vessels began in the deepest chambers of the White Palace, in laboratories that had been carved from the living rock and lined with materials that could contain and channel the power of the void. The Pale King and the White Lady worked together, combining their essences to create new life, then deliberately exposing that life to the void's influence before consciousness could fully develop. The first attempts were failures. The vessels that emerged were either too weak to contain the void's power, or too strong to be properly controlled. Some retained fragments of consciousness that made them unsuitable for their intended purpose, while others were so completely empty that they could not function at all. But gradually, through trial and error, through countless heartbreaking failures and small successes, the King and Queen began to perfect their technique. They learned to balance the competing forces of creation and destruction, of consciousness and emptiness, of their own divine nature and the void's primordial power. The vessels that emerged from these experiments were beings of terrible beauty and profound sadness. They possessed the physical forms of their parents, pale, elegant, possessed of an otherworldly grace, but their eyes were empty, their minds silent, their hearts hollow. They moved through the world like living ghosts, present but not truly alive, conscious but not truly aware. Each vessel was tested rigorously to ensure its suitability for the task ahead. They were exposed to various forms of temptation and corruption, challenged with puzzles and obstacles that would reveal any hidden traces of individual will or desire. Those that showed even the slightest sign of independent thought were deemed failures and discarded, while those that remained perfectly empty were preserved for the final phase of the plan. The Pale King's goal was to create a single perfect vessel, one that could contain not just the power of the void, but the radiance herself. This vessel would serve as a prison, a living cage that could hold the goddess of light and dreams until the infection could be purged from the kingdom and order restored. But creating such a vessel required more than just technical skill. It required a level of sacrifice that tested the very limits of the king's resolve. The perfect vessel would have to be more than empty. It would have to be absolutely pure, completely untainted by any trace of consciousness or individual will. It would have to be, in every sense of the word, hollow. The vessel that would eventually be chosen for this terrible honour was one among many, indistinguishable from its siblings in appearance, but somehow more perfectly empty than any that had come before. It showed no signs of curiosity, no traces of fear or hope or desire. It was a perfect void in the shape of a being, a living absence that could contain the fullness of a god. As the Pale King prepared this chosen vessel for its destiny, he could not help but feel a profound sense of loss. This creature was his child, born of his essence and the White Lady's love, but it would never know the joy of existence, never experience the wonder of consciousness, never understand the magnitude of the sacrifice it was making for the sake of others. The vessel would become known to history as the Hollow Knight, though it would never know that name or understand its significance. It was the culmination of the Pale King's desperate plan to save his kingdom, the ultimate expression of his willingness to sacrifice everything, even his own children, for the greater good. But as events would eventually prove, even the most perfect vessel can develop cracks, and even the most carefully laid plans can fail in ways their creators never anticipated. The Hollow Night would indeed contain the radiance, but the cost of that containment would be higher than anyone could have imagined, and the consequences would echo through the ages long after the Pale King himself had passed into legend. The day of the sealing was marked by an eerie stillness that settled over all of Hallownest. The infection had reached its peak, with vast swathes of the kingdom consumed by the radiance's blazing light. Infected creatures wandered the tunnels and chambers like living torches, their minds lost to dreams of ancient glory and forgotten devotion. The very air seemed to shimmer with otherworldly radiance, and the boundaries between dream and reality had begun to blur. In the deepest chambers of the White Palace, the Pale King made his final preparations. The Hollow Night stood before him, silent and motionless, its empty eyes reflecting nothing of the momentous task that lay ahead. Around them, the greatest scholars and mages of the kingdom had gathered to witness and assist in what would either be the salvation of their civilization or its final, desperate act of self-destruction. The ritual itself was a masterwork of metaphysical engineering, combining elements of void manipulation, dream architecture, and the fundamental forces that governed consciousness itself. The Pale King had spent years perfecting the techniques required, drawing upon knowledge that stretched back to the earliest days of his transformation from worm to king. At the centre of the ritual chamber stood a structure that defied easy description. Part throne, part prison, part gateway between the realms of waking and sleeping. It had been constructed from materials that existed at the intersection of dream and reality, substances that could contain and channel the power of gods while remaining stable in the physical world. The Hollow Knight approached this structure with the same emotionless grace that characterized all its actions. There was no hesitation, no fear, no last-moment doubt. Such things were impossible for a being that's been deliberately stripped of all capacity for independent thought or feeling. It simply walked forward and took its place upon the throne, ready to fulfill the purpose for which it had been created. The Pale King began the incantation, speaking words in a language that predated consciousness itself, calling upon forces that existed in the spaces between thoughts. The air in the chamber began to thicken and darken as the void responded to his summons, flowing up from the deepest places of the earth to surround and infuse the Hollow Night. But the true challenge was not summoning the void. It was calling forth the radiance herself. The goddess of light and dreams had grown immensely powerful during the years of infection, fed by the devotion and memory of countless infected creatures. She was no longer merely a deity, but a force of nature, a living embodiment of consciousness itself. The Pale King's call reached out across the kingdom, piercing through layers of dream and reality to touch the radiance's blazing essence. For a moment there was resistance. The goddess understood what was being attempted and fought against the summons with all her considerable power. But the call was irresistible, woven as it was from the very fabric of consciousness that she herself embodied. The radiance came not willingly, but inevitably, drawn by the same forces that had once made her a goddess. She manifested in the ritual chamber as a being of pure light, her form shifting and changing like a living sun, her presence so intense that the very stones began to glow with reflected radiance. The battle that followed was unlike anything that had ever been witnessed in the physical world. It was fought not with weapons or magic, but with the fundamental forces of existence itself. The radiance struck out with beams of pure consciousness, seeking to overwhelm the Hollow Knight's emptiness with the fullness of her being. But the vessel held firm, its perfect hollowness absorbing and containing her attacks without being filled or corrupted. The Pale King channeled the power of the void through his chosen vessel, using the Hollow Knight as a conduit to drain the Radiance's strength and bind her essence. It was a delicate process that required absolute precision. Too little force and the goddess would break free, too much and the vessel itself might be destroyed. Slowly, inexorably, the Radiance's struggles began to weaken. Her brilliant form grew dimmer as more and more of her essence was drawn into the Hollow Knight's empty shell. The infection that had plagued the kingdom began to recede as its source was cut off from the world, leaving behind only empty husks where once there had been blazing devotion. But even as victory seemed assured, the Pale King began to notice troubling signs. The Hollow Knight, which had remained perfectly motionless throughout the ritual, was beginning to show subtle signs of strain. Its breathing had become slightly laboured, its posture marginally less perfect. Most disturbing of all, there seemed to be something stirring behind its empty eyes. Not consciousness exactly, but perhaps the potential for consciousness. The king realised with growing horror that his perfect vessel was not as hollow as he'd believed. Somewhere in the depths of the Hollow Knight's being, there remained a tiny spark of individual will, a fragment of the consciousness that should have been completely absent. It was microscopic, barely detectable, but it was there, and it was growing stronger as the Radiance's essence filled the vessel. But it was too late to stop the ritual now. The Radiance was already more than half contained, and any interruption would likely result in her breaking free with even greater power than before. The Pale King could only watch in anguish as his imperfect vessel struggled to contain a force that was slowly awakening the very consciousness that made it unsuitable for its task. The final moments of the sealing were marked by a terrible silence. The Radiance's struggles ceased as the last of her essence was drawn into the Hollow Knight, and the blazing light that had filled the chamber faded to a dim glow. The infection throughout the kingdom stopped spreading, its victims falling into a deep, dreamless sleep from which many would never wake. The Hollow Knight sat upon its throne, now serving as both prison and prisoner. Within its hollow shell, the Radiance raged against her confinement, but her power was contained, channeled through the vessel's emptiness and held in check by the void's influence. The kingdom was saved, but at a cost that would haunt the Pale King for the rest of his existence. In the days that followed, the full extent of that cost became clear. The Hollow Knight was not the perfect vessel the king had hoped to create. The tiny spark of consciousness within it continued to grow, fed by its proximity to the Radiance's essence. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the vessel began to develop something resembling individual will. This development was catastrophic for the long-term stability of the seal. The Radiance, trapped within the Hollow Knight's shell, began to work on that growing consciousness, whispering to it in dreams, showing it visions of freedom and purpose, gradually corrupting the very emptiness that was supposed to contain her. The Pale King watched this slow deterioration with growing despair. He had sacrificed everything, his children, his principles, his very soul, to create a solution that was fundamentally flawed. The vessel that was supposed to contain the Radiance forever was slowly becoming conscious, and with consciousness came the possibility of choice, of rebellion, of failure. But there was nothing he could do to stop it. The ritual could not be repeated, The vessel could not be replaced, and the radiance could not be released without destroying everything he had fought to protect. The Pale King was trapped by the consequences of his own desperate measures, forced to watch as his imperfect solution slowly unravelled. The Hollow Knight remained on its throne, a living monument to the price of salvation and the tragedy of imperfection. Within its shell, two forces struggled for dominance, the Radiance's blazing consciousness and the Void's perfect emptiness, with the vessel's own growing awareness caught between them. The kingdom was safe for now. The infection had been contained, the Radiance imprisoned, and order restored to the realm. But the Pale King knew that this peace was temporary, built upon foundations that were already beginning to crack. Someday, somehow, the seal would fail, and when it did, the consequences would be even more terrible than the original plague. Until that day came, the Hollow Knight would continue its vigil, bearing a burden that no conscious being should ever have to carry, serving as both the salvation and the doom of the kingdom it had been created to protect. In the years following the sealing of the Radiance, Hallownest entered what historians would later call its Golden Age. With the infection contained and the threat of the Light Goddess neutralized, the Pale King's vision of perfect order finally seemed within reach. The kingdom flourished as never before, its citizens free to pursue the heights of civilization without fear of corruption or chaos. The recovery was remarkably swift. The infected, freed from the Radiance's influence, gradually returned to their normal lives, though many retained no memory of their time under her sway. The empty husks left behind by those who'd been too deeply affected were quietly removed, and new citizens took their places in the kingdom's grand design. The Pale King threw himself into the work of reconstruction with renewed vigour. New cities were built, connected by an elaborate network of tunnels and passages that spanned the entire underground realm. The architecture of these settlements reflected the king's aesthetic preferences: clean lines, geometric precision, and an abundance of the pale, luminous stone that had become the signature of his reign. Education and learning flourished during this period. The Scholars' Academy expanded its programs, attracting students from across the kingdom and beyond. New fields of study were established, from the practical sciences of engineering and medicine to the more esoteric disciplines of consciousness theory and dream architecture. The Great Archive grew to encompass vast halls filled with scrolls, tablets, and books that contained the accumulated wisdom of ages. The arts too reached new heights of sophistication. Painters and sculptors created works that captured the serene beauty of the king's ordered world, while musicians composed symphonies that reflected the mathematical precision of his philosophy. Literature flourished, with poets and writers exploring themes of duty, sacrifice, and the triumph of reason over chaos. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement of this golden age was the development of what the king called the perfect society, a social system so precisely calibrated that every citizen knew their exact place and purpose within the greater whole. There was no unemployment, no crime, no social unrest. Everyone had a role to play, and everyone played it with dedication and skill. The Pale King himself seemed to embody the perfection he'd created. He ruled with wisdom and justice, making decisions based on careful analysis and rational consideration rather than emotion or personal preference. His court was a model of efficiency and competence, staffed by individuals who had been selected purely on the basis of their abilities and dedication to the kingdom's welfare. The White Lady too played a crucial role in this golden age. Her influence brought a warmth and vitality to the king's sometimes austere vision, ensuring that the pursuit of perfection did not come at the cost of beauty or joy. Under her guidance, gardens and parks were established throughout the kingdom, bringing life and colour to the pale stone corridors. Yet even during this time of unprecedented prosperity and peace, there were those who sensed that something was not quite right. The perfection of Hallownest society was perhaps too perfect, its order too complete. There was a sterile quality to the kingdom's achievements, a sense that something essential had been lost in the pursuit of absolute efficiency. The most perceptive observers noticed that creativity and innovation, while still present, had become increasingly constrained by the demands of the system. Artists were expected to work within established parameters, scientists to pursue only approved lines of research, citizens to express themselves only in ways that supported the greater good. The wild, chaotic creativity that had once characterized the underground realm had been tamed and channeled into acceptable forms. More troubling still were the occasional reports of strange dreams that plagued some of the kingdom's citizens. These were not the blazing visions of the radiance that had characterized the infection, but something subtler and more disturbing. Dreams of emptiness, of vast hollow spaces, of a darkness that was not merely the absence of light, but the absence of everything. The Pale King dismissed these reports as the lingering effects of the recent crisis, psychological scars that would heal with time. But privately he was troubled by their implications. He knew better than anyone what lay at the heart of his kingdom's perfection. The hollow night, sitting in eternal vigil, containing within its shell the very force that had once threatened to destroy everything. The king had hoped that the sealing would be permanent, that the radiance would remain trapped forever within the vessel he had created. But as the years passed, he began to detect subtle signs that all was not well. The hollow night, which had once been perfectly motionless, occasionally showed minute signs of movement. Its breathing, once so regular as to be almost mechanical, sometimes displayed slight irregularities. Most disturbing of all were the reports from the few servants who were permitted to approach the sealed chamber. They spoke of sounds, not voices exactly, but something like whispers or sighs that seemed to emanate from the hollow night itself. When questioned, the vessel remained as silent and motionless as ever, but the reports continued to accumulate. The Pale King began to spend more and more time in the sealed chamber, studying his creation with growing concern. He could see what others could not, the tiny but growing spark of consciousness that flickered behind the hollow knight's empty eyes. It was still barely perceptible, more potential than actual awareness, but it was definitely there and definitely growing stronger. This development filled the king with a complex mixture of emotions. On one hand, he felt a father's pride in seeing his child develop consciousness, the very thing he had worked so hard to achieve in his own transformation from worm to king. But on the other hand, he understood the catastrophic implications of this development for the kingdom's safety. The hollow night had been created to be empty, to serve as a perfect vessel for containing the radiance's essence. But consciousness, by its very nature, was incompatible with perfect emptiness. As the vessel became more aware, it would become less capable of containing its prisoner. Eventually, the growing consciousness would create cracks in the seal, and through these cracks the radiance would begin to seep back into the world. The king considered various solutions to this growing problem. He could attempt to create a new vessel, but the process had taken years to perfect the first time, and there was no guarantee that a second attempt would be any more successful. He could try to suppress the Hollow Knight's developing consciousness, but such an intervention might damage the seal and release the radiance immediately. In the end, he chose to do nothing, hoping against hope that the vessel's consciousness would remain weak enough to maintain the seal indefinitely. It was a decision born of desperation rather than wisdom, but it was the only option that did not involve immediate catastrophic risk. As the Golden Age continued, the Pale King became increasingly withdrawn and melancholy. The weight of his knowledge, the understanding that his perfect kingdom was built upon foundations that were slowly crumbling, began to take its toll on his once confident demeanour. He spent long hours in contemplation, searching for solutions that seemed increasingly elusive. The White Lady, sensitive to her husband's growing distress, tried to offer comfort and support, but even she could not fully understand the magnitude of the crisis they faced. The Radiance's imprisonment was not merely a political or military victory. It was a fundamental alteration of the nature of consciousness itself, and the consequences of its failure would extend far beyond the borders of Hallownest. Meanwhile, in the depths of the sealed chamber, the Hollow Knight continued its silent vigil. Within its shell, the Radiance raged against her confinement, working tirelessly to corrupt the growing consciousness that was her only hope of escape. And slowly, imperceptibly, the perfect vessel began to develop the very flaws that would eventually doom the kingdom it had been created to protect. The Golden Age of Hallownest was drawing to a close, though few yet realised it. The seeds of decline had been planted in the very moment of the kingdom's greatest triumph, and they were beginning to sprout in the darkness of the sealed chamber, where light and void struggled for dominance in the heart of a slowly awakening mind. As decades passed in Hallownest's golden age, the first hairline fractures began to appear in the Pale King's perfect society. They were subtle at first, minor inconsistencies in behaviour, small deviations from established patterns, brief moments when citizens seemed to pause and look around as if seeing their world for the first time. The changes began with the dreams. Citizens who had enjoyed peaceful, ordered sleep for years suddenly found themselves experiencing vivid, chaotic visions that left them confused and unsettled upon waking. These were not the blazing dreams of radiance that had characterized the infection, but something different. Fragments of memory, glimpses of possibilities, whispers of a consciousness that was not their own. The Pale King scholars initially attributed these phenomena to natural variations in sleep patterns, perhaps caused by changes in diet or environment. But as the reports multiplied and the dreams became more intense, it became clear that something more significant was occurring. The carefully maintained boundaries between conscious thought and unconscious experience were beginning to blur. In the sealed chamber deep beneath the White Palace, the source of these disturbances continued its slow transformation. The Hollow Knight, once perfectly still and silent, now exhibited subtle signs of internal struggle. Its breathing had become irregular, sometimes stopping entirely for long periods, before resuming with a sharp intake that echoed through the chamber like a sigh of pain. More disturbing still were the moments when the vessel seemed to be fighting against invisible restraints. Its hands would clench and unclench, its head would turn slightly from side to side, and occasionally A sound that might have been a whisper or a moan would escape from behind its sealed mask. These episodes were brief and infrequent, but they were becoming more common with each passing month. The Pale King spent increasing amounts of time observing his creation, documenting every change, every sign of the growing consciousness that threatened to undermine everything he had built. He could see the process unfolding with terrible clarity. The radiance, trapped within the vessel's shell, was slowly corrupting the emptiness that contained her, using the Hollow Knight's developing awareness as a pathway back into the world. The corruption was not violent or sudden, but gradual and insidious. The radiance whispered to the growing consciousness within the Hollow Knight, showing it visions of freedom and purpose, gradually awakening desires and emotions that should never have existed in a perfect vessel. She spoke of the beauty of dreams, the joy of memory, the warmth of connection with other conscious beings. And slowly, inevitably, the Hollow Knight began to listen. This spark of consciousness that had been barely perceptible at the time of the sealing grew brighter with each passing day, fed by the radiance's influence and its own natural development. What had once been a perfect void began to fill with thoughts, feelings, and most dangerously of all, individual will. The effects of this transformation rippled outward from the sealed chamber like waves from a stone dropped in still water. The citizens of Hallownest, connected to their kingdom's consciousness through bonds they did not fully understand, began to experience echoes of the Hollow Knight's awakening awareness. Their dreams became more vivid, their thoughts more independent, their behaviour less predictable. The Pale King watched these changes with growing alarm. His perfect society was becoming less perfect with each passer's day, as citizens began to question established routines, explore forbidden thoughts, and express desires that had no place in his ordered world. The very consciousness he had once celebrated in his own transformation was now threatening to destroy everything he had created. Some citizens began to experience what could only be described as memories that were not their own, glimpses of ancient times when the underground realm had been wild and chaotic, when dreams had been more real than waking life, when a radiant goddess had walked among her followers in visions of light and love. These memories were fragmentary and confusing, but they carried with them a sense of loss, of something precious that had been taken away. The White Lady was among the first to recognize the true nature of what was happening. Her connection to the natural world made her sensitive to the subtle changes in the kingdom's spiritual atmosphere, and she could feel the growing presence of something that should have remained forever sealed. She tried to discuss her concerns with the Pale King, but he was too consumed by his own guilt and fear to listen to her warnings. As the situation deteriorated, some of the kingdom's more perceptive citizens began to seek out the source of the disturbances. They followed the strange dreams and half-remembered visions deeper into the palace complex, drawn by an instinct they could not explain toward the sealed chamber where the Hollow Knight maintained its vigil. These seekers were turned away by the palace guards, but their very presence was troubling to the Pale King. If ordinary citizens could sense the location of the seal, then the containment was failing more rapidly than he had feared. The Radiance's influence was seeping through the cracks in the Hollow Knight's consciousness, reaching out to touch the minds of those who were sensitive enough to perceive it. The king began to implement increasingly desperate measures to maintain order. Citizens who reported unusual dreams were subjected to intensive questioning, and, in some cases, memory modification procedures designed to erase the troubling visions. Those who showed signs of seeking out the sealed chamber were quietly relocated to distant parts of the kingdom, away from the source of the disturbance. But these measures only delayed the inevitable. The Hollow Knight's consciousness continued to grow, and with it, the Radiance's ability to influence the world beyond her prison. The perfect vessel was becoming imperfect, and there was nothing the Pale King could do to stop the process without risking the immediate release of his greatest enemy. In the depths of the sealed chamber, the Hollow Knight began to experience something that might have been called suffering. The growing awareness within its shell brought with it the capacity for pain, confusion, and longing. It began to understand, in a dim and fragmentary way, the nature of its existence, created to be empty, forced to contain the essence of a god, denied the very consciousness that made existence meaningful. The Radiance, sensing this growing awareness, intensified her efforts to corrupt and control it. She showed the Hollow Knight visions of what it could become if freed from its burden, a true individual, capable of thought and feeling at choice. She whispered promises of liberation, of purpose beyond mere containment, of a life that was more than just an endless vigil in the darkness, and slowly, tragically, the Hollow Knight began to want these things. The perfect emptiness that has made it suitable as a vessel was filling with desire, hope, and most dangerously of all, the will to be free. Each new thought, each growing emotion, created another crack in the seal that contained the Radiance, another pathway through which her influence could seep back into the world. The Pale King could see the end approaching with terrible clarity. His perfect kingdom, built upon the sacrifice of his own children and the suppression of natural consciousness, was doomed to fall. The very perfection he had sought to achieve had contained within it the seeds of its own destruction, and there was nothing he could do to prevent the coming catastrophe. As the Golden Age drew to its close, the king began to make preparations for what he knew would be the final chapter in Hallownest's history. If his kingdom was doomed to fall, then perhaps he could at least ensure that some record of its achievements would survive. He began to compile the great archives, to preserve the knowledge and wisdom that had been accumulated during his reign, hoping that future generations might learn from both his successes and his failures. But even as he worked to preserve his legacy, the Pale King could not escape the growing sense that his greatest achievement, the transformation of chaos into order, of instinct into consciousness, had also been his greatest mistake. In seeking to create perfection, he had destroyed the very thing that made existence beautiful, the wild, unpredictable, chaotic nature of consciousness itself. The cracks in paradise were widening, and through them the light of ancient dreams was beginning to shine once more. The end, when it came, was both sudden and inevitable. After years of gradual deterioration, the seal containing the Radiance finally reached its breaking point. The Hollow Knight, now possessed of a consciousness that was no longer hollow, could no longer serve as a perfect vessel for the goddess of light and dreams. The first sign of the catastrophic failure came in the form of a sound that had never been heard in the sealed chamber before. The Hollow Knight spoke. It was not words in any conventional sense, but a cry of anguish that seemed to contain within it all the pain and confusion of a being that had been denied its own existence for far too long. The sound echoed through the palace corridors, reaching the ears of every creature within miles and filling them with a profound sense of loss and longing. The Pale King, who'd been maintaining his vigil in the chamber, watched in horror as cracks began to appear in the very air around the Hollow Knight. These were not physical fractures, but tears in the fabric of reality itself, places where the boundary between dream and waking had become so thin that it could no longer hold. Through these cracks, the Radiance's light began to seep back into the world, carrying with it the infection that had once nearly destroyed the kingdom. But this new outbreak was different from the original plague, where the first infection had been chaotic and uncontrolled. This one was focused and purposeful. The Radiance had learned from her imprisonment, had grown stronger and more cunning during her years of confinement. She no longer sought merely to reclaim her followers, she wanted revenge against the king who had dared to cage a god. The infection spread with terrifying speed, but instead of the random wandering that had characterized the original plague, the infected now moved with purpose and coordination. They converged on the White Palace, drawn by an irresistible compulsion to free their goddess from her prison and punish those who had wronged her. The Pale King found himself facing a crisis that was far worse than anything he had encountered before. His perfect kingdom was collapsing around him. His subjects were turning into enemies, and the very foundations of reality were beginning to crack under the strain of containing forces that were never meant to be imprisoned. In desperation, he turned to the White Lady, seeking her counsel and support in this darkest hour. But when he reached their private chambers, he found her already deep in the process of her own transformation. The Queen had made a decision that would haunt the kingdom for generations to come. She had chosen to bind herself with thorns and roots, sealing away her own power to prevent it from being corrupted by the spreading infection. "I cannot bear to see what we have created," she told him, her voice already growing distant as the binding took hold. "The children we sacrificed, the consciousness we destroyed, the dreams we stole. It was too much, my king. I must remove myself from this world before I become part of the destruction." The Pale King watched in anguish as his beloved queen disappeared into a cocoon of living vines. Her power sealed away, her consciousness retreating into a deep sleep from which she might never wake. He was alone now, facing the collapse of everything he had built, with no one to share the burden of his choices. As the infection reached the palace itself, the king made a decision that would define his final legacy. If he could not save his kingdom, then perhaps he could at least ensure that the knowledge and wisdom of Hallownest would survive its fall. He began the process of creating what he called the Eternal Archive, a repository of consciousness itself that would preserve the essence of his civilization even after its physical form had been destroyed. The process required the ultimate sacrifice. The king would have to give up his own existence, transforming himself into pure information that could be stored and preserved indefinitely. It was a form of immortality, but one that came at the cost of everything that made life worth living. Working frantically as the infected forces closed in around him, the Pale King began to encode the memories, knowledge, and experiences of his entire reign into crystalline structures that could survive the coming catastrophe. He preserved the architectural plans of his great cities, the philosophical treatises of his scholars, the artistic achievements of his subjects, and most importantly, the hard-won wisdom about the nature of consciousness and the dangers of trying to perfect it. But even as he worked, the king could not escape the growing realization that his greatest creation, the Hollow Knight itself, was the key to both the kingdom's destruction and its potential salvation. The vessel that had failed to contain the radiance might yet serve a different purpose, if only someone could be found who understood its true nature and potential. In his final moments of physical existence, the Pale King created one last desperate gambit. He scattered fragments of his consciousness throughout the kingdom, embedding them in hidden chambers and secret passages where they might be discovered by future explorers. These fragments contained not just knowledge, but a plea, a request for someone, anyone, to complete the work he had begun and find a way to truly end the cycle of infection and containment that had doomed his kingdom. The transformation was agonizing as the king felt his individual consciousness dissolving into component parts that would be preserved in crystal and stone. But even as his sense of self faded away, he held on to one final hope, that somewhere in the vast underground realm there existed another vessel, another being capable of succeeding where the Hollow Knight had failed. As the Pale King's physical form crumbled to dust, the White Palace began its own transformation. The impossible architecture that had defied conventional understanding started to fold in on itself, creating a maze of passages and chambers that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The palace became a puzzle, a test that would challenge any who sought to uncover its secrets and claim the knowledge hidden within. The infected forces that had been converging on the palace found themselves facing not a target to destroy, but a labyrinth that seemed to shift and change with each step they took. Many became lost in the twisting passages, their minds overwhelmed by the complex geometries that the king had woven into the very structure of his final creation. Meanwhile, throughout the kingdom, the effects of the seal's failure continued to spread. Cities that had once been models of order and efficiency descended into chaos as their inhabitants fell victim to the returning infection. The great works of art and architecture began to crumble, not from physical decay, but from the loss of the consciousness that had given them meaning and purpose. But not everything was lost. In hidden chambers and forgotten passages, the Pale King's final preparations began to take effect. Automated systems activated, preserving crucial knowledge and maintaining essential functions even as the kingdom around them fell into ruin. Secret vaults sealed themselves, protecting their contents from the chaos above, and in the deepest places of the realm, new vessels began to stir, beings that had been created as backups to the Hollow Knight, awakening now that their primary purpose had become clear. The great experiment of Hallow Nest was ending, but its legacy would endure. The knowledge gained through the king's reign, the understanding of consciousness and its limitations, the hard-won wisdom about the price of perfection, all of this would survive, waiting for someone worthy to discover it and learn from both its triumphs and its failures. As the infection spread and the kingdom fell, one truth became clear. The Pale King's greatest achievement was not the civilization he had built, but the understanding he had gained about the nature of consciousness itself. And that understanding, preserved in crystal and stone, would be his final gift to whatever future might emerge from the ruins of his perfect world. In the aftermath of Hallownest's collapse, the kingdom entered a state of suspended animation that would last for countless years. The infection had spread throughout the realm, but without the Pale King's guiding consciousness to give it direction, it had settled into a kind of stasis. The infected wandered the empty corridors and abandoned chambers like sleepwalkers, driven by instincts they could not understand toward goals they could not remember. The Hollow Knight remained on its throne in the sealed chamber, but its vigil had taken on a new character. No longer the perfect vessel it had been created to be, It now served as a flawed but functional prison for the Radiance. The goddess of light and dreams was contained, but not completely. Her influence continued to seep through the cracks in the knight's consciousness, maintaining the infection while being unable to fully manifest in the physical world. This precarious balance might have continued indefinitely, but the Pale King's final preparations had set in motion events that would eventually lead to a resolution of the ancient conflict. Deep in the abyss, where the void had first given birth to consciousness, something new was stirring. Among the countless failed vessels that had been discarded during the creation of the Hollow Knight, one small figure began to move. It was indistinguishable from its siblings in appearance, a small pale creature with empty eye sockets and a cracked shell, but something within it was different. Where the others remained motionless in death, this one possessed a spark of animation that defied explanation. The creature that would come to be known simply as the Knight was neither hollow nor filled, neither perfectly empty nor completely conscious. It existed in a state between states, possessing just enough awareness to act, but not enough to be corrupted by individual desire. It was in many ways what the Hollow Knight should have been, a being capable of choice without being driven by selfish motivation. The Knight's awakening was gradual and mysterious. It began with simple movement, the ability to walk, to climb, to navigate the treacherous passages of the abyss. Slowly, it developed more complex capabilities, the power to focus soul, the ability to learn new techniques, the capacity to understand and respond to the world around it. But perhaps most importantly, the Knight possessed something that the Hollow Knight had lacked, the ability to grow and change without losing its essential nature. Each new experience, each challenge overcome, each skill mastered, added to its capabilities without corrupting its fundamental emptiness. It was a paradox made manifest, a being that could become more than it was while remaining exactly what it needed to be. The Knight's journey through the ruins of Hallownest was both a pilgrimage and an education. As it explored the abandoned kingdom, it encountered the remnants of the Pale King civilization, the infected creatures that had once been citizens, the crumbling architecture that had once housed a thriving society, the fragments of knowledge and memory that had survived the Great Collapse. Each encounter taught the Knight something new about the nature of consciousness, sacrifice, and the price of perfection. It learned about the radiance from the dreams of infected creatures, about the Pale King from the echoes of his consciousness that lingered in hidden chambers, about the tragedy of the Hollow Knight from the very structure of the sealed chamber itself. But the Knight's education was not merely academic. As it grew stronger and more capable, it began to take on the burdens that others could not bear. It freed trapped souls from their infected shells, ended the suffering of creatures that had been twisted beyond recognition, and gradually worked its way toward the heart of the kingdom where the greatest challenge awaited. The Knight's approach to the sealed chamber was marked by a series of trials that tested not just its physical capabilities, but its understanding of the forces it would soon confront. It had to prove its mastery over the void, demonstrate its resistance to the Radiance's influence, and show that it possessed the wisdom necessary to succeed where others had failed. When the Knight finally stood before the Hollow Knight, the meeting was both a confrontation and a recognition. The two vessels, one flawed by consciousness, the other perfected through experience, faced each other across the chamber that had been the site of so much sacrifice and suffering. The battle that followed was unlike any that had been fought before in Hallow Nest. It was not a conflict between enemies, but a struggle between two aspects of the same essential nature. The Hollow Knight, driven by the Radiance's influence and its own growing desperation, fought with the fury of a being that had been denied its own existence for too long. The knight responded with the calm precision of one who had learned to act without being driven by emotional desire. As the battle progressed, the true nature of the conflict became clear. This was not about victory or defeat, but about release and redemption. The Hollow Knight was not the enemy. It was a victim, a being that had been created for a purpose it could never truly fulfill, and had suffered for eons as a result of its imperfection. The knight's victory, when it came, was also an act of mercy. By defeating the Hollow Knight, it freed its sibling from a burden that had become unbearable, allowing the flawed vessel to finally rest after its long and painful vigil. But in doing so, the knight also took on that same burden, becoming the new prison for the Radiance's essence. The choice to enter the sealed chamber and take the Hollow Knight's place was made freely, without coercion or manipulation. The knight understood the cost of its decision, an eternity of containment, of serving as a living prison for a force that would never stop trying to escape. But it also understood the necessity of that sacrifice, the importance of maintaining the seal that protected the world from the Radiance's chaotic influence. As the knight settled onto the throne that had been the Hollow Knight's prison, it felt the weight of the Radiance's essence flowing into its shell. But unlike its predecessor, the knight was prepared for this burden. Its experiences in the ruined kingdom had taught it how to remain empty while still being capable of action, how to contain without being contained, how to sacrifice without losing itself in the process. The Radiance, finding herself once again imprisoned, raged against her new captor with all the fury she had accumulated during her previous confinement. But the knight's emptiness was different from the Hollow Knight's. It was not the absence of consciousness, but the presence of a consciousness that had learned to exist without desire or attachment. The goddess of light and dreams found that her usual methods of corruption were ineffective against this new vessel. Where she had been able to awaken desire and individual will in the Hollow Knight, she found only a serene acceptance in the knight. Where she had once been able to plant seeds of doubt and rebellion, she now encountered only a calm determination to fulfill a chosen purpose. And so the eternal vigil began anew, but with a crucial difference. Where the Hollow Knight had been a flawed vessel slowly failing under the pressure of its burden, the knight was a perfected container that could maintain its integrity indefinitely. The seal was stronger now, more stable, capable of containing the Radiance's essence without the gradual deterioration that had doomed the previous attempt. In the depths of the sealed chamber, the knight began its watch, not as a prisoner of fate, but as a willing guardian of the world above. It had chosen this burden freely, understanding both its cost and its necessity, and it would bear it with the same calm determination that had carried it through all the trials of its journey. The kingdom of Hallownest remained in ruins, its golden age a memory preserved only in crystal and stone. But the threat that had once consumed it was contained once more, held in check by a vessel that had learned the most important lesson of all, that true strength comes not from the absence of consciousness, but from the wisdom to use that consciousness in service of something greater than oneself. But the night's vigil, noble as it was, represented only one possible ending to the ancient conflict between order and chaos, between the structured consciousness of the Pale King and the wild dreams of the Radiance. For those with the wisdom to see beyond the physical realm, another path remained, one that led not to eternal containment, but to true resolution. The key to this deeper understanding lay in the nature of dreams themselves. The Radiance was not merely a physical being that could be imprisoned in a vessel of flesh and void. She was a force of pure consciousness, a living embodiment of the collective unconscious that existed in the realm of dreams and memory. To truly defeat her, one would have to confront her not in the waking world, but in the very heart of the dream realm itself. This realization came to those who had learned to navigate the spaces between sleeping and waking, who had mastered the art of lucid dreaming and conscious exploration of the unconscious mind. They understood that the infection was not just a plague of light, but a manifestation of suppressed memories and forgotten dreams that had been denied their natural expression. The path to the dream realm was not easy to find. It required the seeker to first understand the true nature of consciousness itself, not as the Pale King had conceived it, as a force to be ordered and controlled, but as the Radiance had known it, as a wild and beautiful chaos that gave meaning to existence. Only by embracing both aspects of consciousness could one hope to navigate the treacherous waters of the dream realm. The journey began with the acquisition of the Dream Nail, an ancient artifact that had been created in the earliest days of the kingdom, when the boundaries between dream and reality were still fluid and permeable. This mystical blade could cut through the barriers that separated the conscious mind from the unconscious, allowing its wielder to enter the dreams of others and explore the hidden landscapes of memory and desire. With the dream nail in hand, the seeker could begin to unravel the complex web of dreams and nightmares that had been woven throughout Hallownest during its long history. Each infected creature carried within its mind a fragment of the greater dream, a piece of the puzzle that, when assembled, would reveal the true nature of the Radiance's power and the source of her endless rage. The exploration of these dream fragments revealed a story that was far more complex and tragic than the simple narrative of a goddess seeking to reclaim her followers. The Radiance had not been a tyrant seeking to impose her will upon unwilling subjects. She had been a loving deity who had cherished her children and sought only to share with them the beauty and wonder of conscious existence. Her transformation into a force of infection and chaos had been the result of her banishment and imprisonment, a corruption born of pain and isolation that had twisted her natural love into something desperate and destructive. The moths who had abandoned her had not been evil or misguided. They had simply been seduced by the promise of a different kind of existence, one that offered security and structure in place of the wild freedom of dreams. But in choosing the Pale King's ordered consciousness over the Radiance's chaotic love, they had created an imbalance that could never be truly resolved through force or containment. The only way to heal the wound that had been torn in the fabric of consciousness itself was to address the underlying cause, the artificial separation between order and chaos, between rational thought and emotional truth, between the waking world and the realm of dreams. This understanding led the seeker deeper into the dream realm, following pathways of memory and association that led back to the very beginning of the conflict. Here, in the deepest layers of the collective unconscious, the true forms of both the Pale King and the Radiance could be encountered. not as the distorted figures they had become through years of conflict, but as they had been in their original uncorrupted states. The Pale King, in his dream form, was revealed to be not a cold tyrant, but a being driven by a genuine desire to help others achieve their full potential. His transformation from worm to king had been motivated not by ambition but by love. Love for the chaotic, struggling creatures he had observed in the world above, and a sincere belief that he could help them create something better than the random suffering that had characterized their existence. Similarly, the Radiance in her true form was not the blazing destructive force she had become, but a gentle goddess of light and warmth who had sought only to nurture and protect her children. Her rage and desperation were the products of her imprisonment and abandonment, emotions that had been amplified and distorted by years of isolation and pain. The final confrontation in the dream realm was not a battle in any conventional sense, but a meeting of understanding between three aspects of consciousness that had been artificially separated. The Seeker, having learned to embody both the order of the Pale King and the chaos of the Radiance, served as a bridge between the two forces, allowing them to recognize their fundamental compatibility. In this moment of recognition, the ancient conflict was finally resolved. The Pale King's order and the Radiance's chaos were revealed to be not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a greater whole. Consciousness, in its fullest expression, required both structure and freedom, both rational thought and emotional truth, both the security of the waking world and the infinite possibilities of dreams. The resolution of this conflict had immediate and profound effects throughout the dream realm, and by extension, the physical world of Hallownest. The infection, no longer sustained by the Radiance's desperate rage, began to fade away like a nightmare dissolving in the light of dawn. The infected creatures, freed from their compulsive wandering, either returned to their normal states or passed peacefully into death. Their suffering finally ended. The Radiance herself, no longer trapped in a cycle of imprisonment and escape, was able to return to her original nature as a goddess of light and dreams. But she did not seek to reclaim her former followers or rebuild her ancient civilization. Instead, she chose to merge her essence with the dream realm itself, becoming not a deity to be worshipped, but a natural force that would ensure the continued balance between order and chaos in the consciousness of all thinking beings. The Pale King too found peace in this resolution. His consciousness, scattered throughout the kingdom in fragments of crystal and stone, was able to reunite and take on a new form, not as a ruler seeking to impose his will, but as a guardian of knowledge and wisdom who would help future generations avoid the mistakes that had led to Hallownest's downfall. The knight, sitting in vigil in the sealed chamber, felt the change as a great weight lifting from its shoulders. The burden it had chosen to bear was no longer necessary. The Radiance was contained not by force but by understanding, held in balance not by imprisonment, but by integration with the greater whole of consciousness itself. In the end, the true victory was not the defeat of one force by another, but the recognition that consciousness, in all its forms, was too complex and beautiful to be reduced to simple categories of order and chaos, good and evil, right and wrong. The greatest wisdom lay not in choosing one aspect over another, but in learning to embrace the full spectrum of conscious experience, with all its contradictions and complexities. The kingdom of Hallownest remained in ruins, its golden age a memory that would never be repeated. But from those ruins, a new understanding had emerged, one that would guide future civilizations away from the trap of seeking perfection through the suppression of natural consciousness, and toward a more balanced and sustainable relationship with the forces that make existence meaningful. And in the dream realm, where all consciousness ultimately converges, the eternal dance between order and chaos, structure and freedom, thought and feeling, continued as it always had and always would, not as a conflict to be resolved, but as a creative tension that gives birth to all the beauty and wonder of conscious existence. As we reach the end of our journey through the depths of Hallownest's history, we find ourselves not with a simple conclusion, but with a profound meditation on the nature of consciousness, sacrifice, and the eternal cycles that govern all existence. The kingdom that began as a worm's dream of transformation became a testament to both the heights that consciousness can achieve and the depths to which it can fall when it loses sight of its own essential nature. The ruins of Hallow Nest stand now as a monument to ambition and hubris, but also to love and sacrifice. Every crumbling wall tells a story of beings who reach for something greater than themselves, who dared to dream of perfection and paid the ultimate price for that dream. The empty corridors echo with the whispers of those who gave everything in service of an ideal that was perhaps too pure for the messy, chaotic reality of conscious existence. In the deepest chambers of the kingdom, where the void still flows like a river of liquid darkness, new vessels continue to stir. They are the children of an ancient dream, born from the union of consciousness and emptiness, carrying within their hollow shells the potential for both salvation and destruction. Some will awaken to find purpose in service to others, while others will remain forever still, their potential unrealized but their sacrifice no less meaningful. The White Lady sleeps still in her cocoon of thorns and roots, her consciousness withdrawn from a world that became too painful to bear. But even in her self-imposed exile, she continues to nurture new life, tending to seeds of possibility that may one day bloom into something beautiful and strange. Her dreams, filtered through layers of bark and vine, seep into the soil of Hallownest, ensuring that the kingdom's legacy will endure in forms yet to be imagined. The Pale King's consciousness, scattered like stars across the vast expanse of his former realm, continues its eternal work of preservation and instruction. In hidden chambers and secret passages, his knowledge waits to be discovered by those who have the wisdom to learn from both his triumphs and his failures. He has become what he always sought to be, a teacher and guide, helping others to navigate the treacherous waters of consciousness without repeating the mistakes that led to his kingdom's fall. And in the realm of dreams, where all consciousness ultimately converges, the radiance dances still. No longer the desperate, raging goddess who sought to reclaim her lost children through force and infection, she has returned to her original nature as a source of light and inspiration. Her influence flows through the dreams of all thinking beings, reminding them of the beauty and wonder that exists in the wild, chaotic spaces of the unconscious mind. The infection that once threatened to consume all of Hallownest has become something else entirely, not a plague to be feared, but a reminder of the importance of balance in all things. It serves as a warning against the dangers of suppressing natural consciousness in favour of artificial order, and as a testament to the resilience of the dreaming mind when faced with forces that seek to control or contain it. The night, whether sitting in eternal vigil or having found peace through deeper understanding, represents the possibility of transcendence through sacrifice. Its journey from the depths of the abyss to the heights of conscious choice demonstrates that even beings created to be empty can find meaning and purpose through their own actions and decisions. But perhaps the most important lesson to be drawn from Hallownest's rise and fall is that consciousness itself is not a problem to be solved or a force to be controlled, but a mystery to be celebrated and explored. The Pale King's great error was not in seeking to create order from chaos, but in believing that order and chaos were fundamentally incompatible. The Radiance's tragedy was not in loving her children too much, but in allowing that love to become possessive and destructive when it was threatened. The true wisdom lies in understanding that consciousness, in all its forms, is a gift that should be cherished rather than constrained. The wild dreams of the Radiance and the structured thoughts of the Pale King are both necessary aspects of the greater whole, and any attempt to privilege one over the other will inevitably lead to imbalance and suffering. As you drift towards sleep, carried by the gentle rhythm of this ancient tale, let your mind wander through the empty corridors of Hallownest. Feel the weight of history in every stone, the echo of dreams in every shadow, the presence of consciousness in every empty space. Remember that you too are part of this eternal cycle, a thinking being capable of both order and chaos, structure and freedom, rational thought and wild dreams. The kingdom of Hallow Nest may have fallen, but its legacy lives on in every conscious mind that dares to dream of something greater than itself. In your dreams tonight, you may find yourself walking through those ancient passages, discovering secrets that have been hidden for ages, learning lessons that can only be taught in the language of sleep and shadow. And when you wake, you will carry with you the wisdom of ruins, the understanding that all civilizations rise and fall, that all dreams eventually end, but that the consciousness that creates them is eternal and indestructible. You will know that you are both the dreamer and the dream, the vessel and the void, the light and the darkness that gives it meaning. Sleep well, traveller of the deep places. Let the story of Hallownest carry you into peaceful rest, knowing that in the realm of dreams all consciousness is one, and all stories eventually lead us home to the truth of what we are. Beings of infinite possibility, forever reaching toward the light while remaining rooted in the darkness that gives that light its power to illuminate. In the end, we are all children of the void and servants of the light, hollow vessels filled with the dreams of gods, carrying within our fragile shells the entire history of consciousness itself. And in that carrying, in that eternal vigil between sleeping and waking, we find our purpose and our peace. The tale is told, the kingdom sleeps, and the eternal cycle continues. Rest now, and dream of deeper things. In the first moments of his new existence, the Pale King felt something that would define everything he would later become: responsibility. He looked upon the chaotic world above and saw not just creatures living their small lives, but potential. Wasted potential. These beings could be so much more than they were, if only someone would show them how. He began his work quietly, carefully, approaching the smaller tribes first, those who struggled most in the harsh underground environment. He didn't arrive with armies or demands, he simply appeared, pale and luminous, and impossible to ignore, and offered them something they had never had: purpose. To the scattered beetle clans he offered unity. To the struggling grub colonies he offered protection. To the lost and wandering creatures of the deep places he offered belonging. And in exchange he asked for only one thing: trust. trust that he could build something better than the chaos they had known. The transformation was gradual but profound. Tribes that had warred for generations found themselves working together toward common goals. Creatures that had lived in squalor discovered the joy of creation, of building something that would outlast their brief lives. The underground realm began to resemble something unprecedented, a true civilization. But even as the Pale King built his kingdom, he remained aware of the greatest challenge he would face. In the high places of the world, the moths continued their ancient communion with their goddess of light and dreams. They represented everything he sought to replace: chaos over order, emotion over logic, the wild unpredictability of natural consciousness over the structured beauty of rational thought. The conflict between them was not inevitable. It was necessary. Two visions of consciousness could not coexist in the same world. One would have to give way to the other, and the Pale King, in his newfound wisdom and terrible love for the creatures he sought to protect, began to plan for a war that would be fought not with weapons, but with the very essence of what it meant to think and dream and remember. Let your thoughts drift now, like the Pale King's consciousness spreading through the tunnels of his growing kingdom. Feel the weight of responsibility, the burden of caring too much, the terrible price of trying to save everyone. In the space between waking and sleeping, you can almost hear the sound of a perfect plan beginning to crack under the weight of its own good intentions. The White Palace rose from the bedrock like a dream made manifest, but not the wild, chaotic dreams of the moths. This was a dream of perfect order, of geometry so precise it hurt to contemplate, of architecture that existed in more dimensions than the mind could comfortably hold. The Pale King had built more than a palace. He had built a machine for thinking, a structure designed to enhance consciousness, while keeping it safely contained within rational boundaries. Every corridor served a purpose, every chamber had its function, every architectural detail was calculated to inspire awe while maintaining order. The walls were constructed from pale, luminous stone that seemed to glow with its own inner light, not the warm, chaotic radiance of the moth goddess, but something cooler, more controlled, light with a purpose. But the true heart of the Pale King's achievement was not the palace itself, but what it represented, the possibility of perfect society. He had found her by then, his queen, his complement, his other half. The White Lady was everything he was not. Where he was structure, she was growth. Where he was thought, she was feeling. Where he was the sharp edge of consciousness, she was its nurturing embrace. Their love was not the passionate, consuming fire of mortal romance, but something deeper and more profound, the recognition of two incomplete beings who together formed something greater than the sum of their parts. She brought life to his order, warmth to his logic, the gentle chaos of growth to balance his rigid perfection. Under their joint rule, Hallownest became something unprecedented in the history of consciousness, a kingdom where every citizen knew their place and purpose, where every action served the greater good, where suffering had been all but eliminated through the careful application of rational thought and benevolent authority. The transformation was miraculous to behold. Creatures that had lived in ignorance discovered the joy of learning. Tribes that had warred for generations found themselves united in common purpose. The chaotic underground realm began to resemble a true civilization, with cities connected by perfectly engineered tunnels, schools where knowledge was preserved and transmitted, libraries where the wisdom of ages was carefully catalogued and stored. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement was the Great Archive, a vast repository of knowledge that sought to contain and organise all the wisdom of the kingdom. Here, teams of scholars worked tirelessly to understand the fundamental laws that governed reality itself, to unlock the secrets of consciousness and memory and dreams, to create a perfect map of existence that would guide future generations toward ever greater heights of achievement. The Pale King walked through his kingdom in those golden days and saw that it was good. Crime had been virtually eliminated through the careful application of education and purpose. Poverty was unknown, as every citizen had their role to play in the greater design. Even death had been tamed, transformed from a chaotic ending into a peaceful transition, carefully managed and ritualized to minimize suffering. And yet, even in those days of unprecedented prosperity and peace, there were signs that something was not quite right. The perfection was perhaps too perfect, the order too complete. Creativity, while still present, had become increasingly constrained by the demands of the system. Art was expected to serve the greater good, science to pursue only approved lines of research, citizens to express themselves only in ways that supported the kingdom's harmony. More troubling still were the occasional reports of strange dreams that plagued some of the kingdom's citizens. Not the blazing visions of infection that would come later, but something subtler and more disturbing. Dreams of emptiness, of vast hollow spaces, of a darkness that be not merely the absence of light, but the absence of everything. The Pale King dismissed these reports, but privately he was troubled. He knew what lay at the heart of his kingdom's perfection, what price had been paid for this unprecedented peace. In the high places of the world, the moths still danced their ancient dances and sang their chaotic songs to a goddess who represented everything he had sought to eliminate from existence. The war between them had begun not with armies or declarations, but with something far more insidious: education. The Pale King's scholars spread throughout the land, offering knowledge and enlightenment to any who would listen. They taught the benefits of rational thought over emotional response, of structured society over chaotic individualism, of planned progress over random change. The message was seductive, particularly to the younger generation of moths who had grown up hearing stories of the wider world beyond their mountain settlements. Why remain trapped in the primitive chaos of their ancestors when they could be part of something greater, something that spanned the entire underground realm? Many moths were drawn to these promises. They left their mountain homes and travelled to the growing cities of Hallownest, where they found work as scholars and artisans and administrators. They learned new skills, adopted new customs, and gradually began to forget the old ways of their ancestors. But most importantly, they began to forget the Radiance herself. The Pale King's education system was designed not just to teach new knowledge, but to reshape the very way his subjects thought about reality. Students were encouraged to value logic over intuition, facts over feelings, the material world over the realm of dreams. As more and more moths embraced this new way of thinking, their connection to the Radiance began to weaken. Dreams that had once been vivid and meaningful became dim and forgettable. The shared consciousness that had bound the moth tribe together for millennia began to fragment and dissolve. And in her realm of light and memory, the Radiance felt each abandonment like a knife to the heart. She was not just losing followers, she was losing children, beings she had loved and nurtured and protected since the dawn of consciousness itself. Each moth that turned away from her was a piece of herself torn away, a light extinguished, a song silenced forever. Your breathing is slower now, deeper, more peaceful. Feel the weight of this ancient tragedy settling over you like a blanket. In the space between sleeping and waking, you can almost hear the sound of a goddess weeping for her lost children, and a king who thought he was saving the world slowly realizing he might be destroying it instead. The Radiance's retaliation, when it came, was not born of malice but of desperation. A mother watching her children forget her name, a goddess feeling her very existence fade as belief turned to skepticism, then to dismissal, then to nothing at all. She reached out through the only means left to her, through dreams themselves, through the deep places of the mind where rational thought could not penetrate. The infection began as whispers in the night, fragments of memory that surfaced in the dreams of those who had once known her light. Former moth scholars would wake with tears on their faces, unable to remember why they wept. Citizens of Hallow Nest found themselves humming melodies they had never heard, songs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the ordered world they knew. But whispers became screams and fragments became floods. The Radiance's desperation grew with each passing day, each forgotten prayer, each child who no longer knew her name. She poured herself into the dreams of any who would receive her, and her light, once warm and nurturing, became blazing and desperate, a sun dying in the darkness of abandonment. The infected wandered the streets of Hallownest's perfect cities, their eyes glowing with orange light, their minds lost to visions of a goddess they could not name but could not forget. They spoke in fragments of ancient songs, reached toward a light that existed only in their dreams, abandoned their carefully assigned roles to search for something their rational minds told them did not exist. The Pale King watched his perfect kingdom begin to crumble and felt something he had not experienced since his transformation from worm to king: helplessness. This was not a problem that could be solved through better organization or more efficient systems. This was consciousness itself rebelling against the constraints he had placed upon it, the wild chaos of natural thought breaking free from the careful structures he had built to contain it. In his desperation, he turned to the ancient forces that had existed before consciousness, before thought, before the very concept of existence itself. The void that had dreamed him into being, that had given birth to creatures of perfect emptiness, that represented the antithesis of everything the Radiance embodied. If light could not be reasoned with, perhaps it could be contained. If consciousness could not be controlled, perhaps it could be imprisoned. If the Radiance would not accept the order he had built, perhaps she could be forced to accept the emptiness that existed before order was even possible. But to harness the void, to shape it into a vessel capable of containing a goddess, would require a sacrifice so profound that even the Pale King, in all his terrible wisdom, hesitated before the magnitude of what he was contemplating. It would require him to create children for the sole purpose of denying them the very thing he had fought so hard to achieve: consciousness itself. Feel the weight of that decision settling into your bones now. The choice between saving a kingdom and sacrificing innocence, between preserving order and destroying love, between being a king and being a father. In the darkness behind your eyelids, you can almost see the Pale King standing at the edge of the abyss, looking down into the void that had given him life, preparing to ask it to take life away. The creation of the vessels was not a single moment, but a process that stretched across years, each attempt a small tragedy, each failure a child lost to the darkness. The Pale King and the White Lady worked together in the deepest chambers of the White Palace, combining their essences to create new life, then deliberately exposing that life to the void's influence before consciousness could fully develop. Picture them if you can, thousands of small pale figures, each one a potential child, each one deliberately denied the gift of awareness that their parents had fought so hard to achieve. They were born into emptiness, raised in silence, tested for the one quality that would make them suitable for their terrible purpose, the complete absence of self. The tests were heartbreaking in their precision. Each vessel was exposed to various forms of temptation and corruption, challenged with puzzles and obstacles that would reveal any hidden traces of individual will or desire. A flicker of curiosity, a moment of fear, the slightest sign of independent thought. Any of these would mark a vessel as a failure, unsuitable for the task ahead. The failures were discarded in the abyss, the deepest place in Hallownest, where the void pooled like black water. They piled up at the bottom of that endless darkness, shells upon shells upon shells, each one a child, each one tested and found wanting, each one thrown away like a broken tool. The Pale King told himself it was necessary. The White Lady wept in silence, her tears falling like rain on the pale stone of the palace. And still the work continued, because the alternative, the complete destruction of everything they had built, was unthinkable. Eventually, one vessel seemed to meet their impossible criteria. It showed no signs of consciousness, no flickers of desire, no traces of the individual will that had doomed so many of its siblings. The Pale King named it the Hollow Knight, and took it from the abyss to be the salvation of his kingdom. But even as he prepared his chosen vessel for its destiny, the Pale King could not escape a terrible truth. The Hollow Knight was not truly hollow. In a moment of weakness, or perhaps of love, he had shown it affection, taken its hand, treated it like a child rather than a tool. And in that moment, something had stirred in the vessel that was supposed to be empty. A bond had formed. An attachment had grown. The Hollow Knight was cracked by kindness. The sealing proceeded anyway, because there was no choice, no time, no other option. The radiance was contained within the Hollow Knight's shell, her light imprisoned in a vessel of living darkness. The infection receded. The kingdom enjoyed years of peace, but a cracked vessel cannot hold forever. The radiance's influence began to leak out, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as the Hollow Knight's consciousness grew stronger. The infection returned, more virulent than before, and the Pale King's perfect plan revealed itself to be fundamentally, tragically flawed. In his final moments, as his kingdom crumbled around him and his greatest creation failed before his eyes, the Pale King made one last desperate gambit. He scattered fragments of his consciousness throughout Hallownest, preserving his knowledge and his regrets in crystal and stone, hoping that someday someone would come who could succeed where he had failed. The White Palace folded in on itself, becoming a maze of impossible geometry, a puzzle that would challenge any who sought to claim the wisdom hidden within. The Pale King's physical form crumbled to dust, but his consciousness lived on, waiting in the spaces between dreams for a vessel that could truly be hollow, a being that could contain the radiance without being corrupted by her light. Your body is completely relaxed now. sinking deeper into the embrace of sleep. The tragedy of Hallownest settles around you like a lullaby, the weight of ancient sorrows transformed into something strangely comforting. In the darkness behind your closed eyes, you can see the ruins of the perfect kingdom, beautiful in their decay, peaceful in their silence, and in the deepest places of that ruined realm something stirs. Not the hollow night, broken by its burden and driven mad by the light it could not contain, but something else, something smaller, quieter, more perfect in its imperfection. A vessel that had been discarded, forgotten, left to die in the abyss with all the other failures. But this one was different. This one had learned something that the Hollow Knight never could. How to be empty while still being capable of choice. How to contain without being contained. How to sacrifice without losing oneself in the process. This one had awakened not to consciousness as the Pale King understood it, but to something deeper and more profound. The wisdom to act without desire, to choose without attachment, to love without possession. The knight's journey through the ruins of Hallow Nest was both an education and a pilgrimage. Each encounter taught it something new about the nature of consciousness, sacrifice, and the price of perfection. It learned about the radiance from the dreams of infected creatures, about the Pale King from the echoes of his consciousness that lingered in hidden chambers, about the tragedy of the Hollow Knight from the very structure of the sealed chamber itself. But the knight's education was not merely academic. As it grew stronger and more capable, it began to take on the burdens that others could not bear. It freed trapped souls from their infected shells, ended the suffering of creatures that had been twisted beyond recognition, and gradually worked its way toward the heart of the kingdom, where the greatest challenge awaited. When the knight finally stood before the Hollow Knight, the meeting was both a confrontation and a recognition. The two vessels, one flawed by consciousness, the other perfected through experience, faced each other across the chamber that had been the site of so much sacrifice and suffering. The battle that followed was unlike any that had been fought before in Hallownest. It was not a conflict between enemies, but a struggle between two aspects of the same essential nature. The Hollow Knight, driven by the Radiance's influence and its own growing desperation, fought with the fury of a being that had been denied its own existence for too long. The knight responded with the calm precision of one who had learned to act without being driven by emotion or desire. The knight's victory, when it came, was also an act of mercy. By defeating the Hollow Knight, it freed its sibling from a burden that had become unbearable, allowing the flawed vessel to finally rest after its long and painful vigil. But in doing so, the knight also took on that same burden, becoming the new prison for the Radiance's essence. The choice was made freely, without coercion or manipulation. The knight understood the cost of its decision, an eternity of containment, of serving as a living prison for a force that would never stop trying to escape. But it also understood the necessity of that sacrifice, the importance of maintaining the seal that protected the world from the Radiance's chaotic influence. As the knight settled onto the throne that has been the Hollow Knight's prison, it felt the weight of the Radiance's essence flowing into its shell. But unlike its predecessor, the knight was prepared for this burden. Its experiences in the ruined kingdom had taught it how to remain empty while still being capable of action, how to contain without being contained, how to sacrifice without losing itself in the process. And so the eternal vigil began anew, but with a crucial difference. Where the Hollow Knight had been a flawed vessel slowly failing under the pressure of its burden, The night was a perfected container that could maintain its integrity indefinitely. The seal was stronger now, more stable, capable of containing the radiance's essence without the gradual deterioration that had doomed the previous attempt. But for those with the wisdom to see beyond the physical realm, another path remained, one that led not to eternal containment, but to true resolution. The key lay in understanding that the radiance was not merely a physical being that could be imprisoned, but a force of pure consciousness that existed in the realm of dreams and memory. To truly defeat her, one would have to confront her not in the waking world, but in the very heart of the dream realm itself. There, in the deepest layers of the collective unconscious, the true forms of both the Pale King and the Radiance could be encountered, not as the distorted figures they had become through years of conflict, but as they had been in their original, uncorrupted states. The final confrontation in the dream realm was not a battle, but a meeting of understanding between three aspects of consciousness that had been artificially separated. The Seeker, having learned to embody both the order of the Pale King and the chaos of the Radiance, served as a bridge between the two forces, allowing them to recognize their fundamental compatibility. In this moment of recognition, the ancient conflict was finally resolved. The Pale King's order and the Radiance's chaos were revealed to be not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a greater whole. Consciousness, in its fullest expression, required both structure and freedom, both rational thought and emotional truth, both the security of the waking world and the infinite possibilities of dreams. The resolution had immediate and profound effect throughout both the dream realm and the physical world of Hallownest. The infection, no longer sustained by the Radiance's desperate rage, began to fade away like a nightmare dissolving in the light of dawn. The infected creatures, freed from their compulsive wandering, either returned to their normal states or passed peacefully into death, their suffering finally ended. The Radiance herself, no longer trapped in a cycle of imprisonment and escape, was able to return to her original nature as a goddess of light and dreams. But she did not seek to reclaim her former followers or rebuild her ancient civilization. Instead, she chose to merge her essence with the dream realm itself, becoming not a deity to be worshipped, but a natural force that would ensure the continued balance between order and chaos in the consciousness of all thinking beings. The Pale King too found peace in this resolution. His consciousness, scattered throughout the kingdom in fragments of crystal and stone, was able to reunite and take on a new form, not as a ruler seeking to impose his will, but as a guardian of knowledge and wisdom who would help future generations avoid the mistakes that had led to Hallownest's downfall. The knight sitting in vigil in the sealed chamber felt the change as a great weight lifting from its shoulders. The burden it had chosen to bear was no longer necessary. The Radiance was contained not by force but by understanding, held in balance not by imprisonment but by integration with the greater whole of consciousness itself. In the end, the true victory was not the defeat of one force by another, but the recognition that consciousness, in all its forms, was too complex and beautiful to be reduced to simple categories of order and chaos, good and evil, right and wrong. The greatest wisdom lay not in choosing one aspect over another, but in learning to embrace the full spectrum of conscious experience, with all its contradictions and complexities. As we reach the end of our journey through the depths of Hallownest's history, we find ourselves not with a simple conclusion, but with a profound meditation on the nature of consciousness, sacrifice, and the eternal cycles that govern all existence. The kingdom that began as a worm's dream of transformation became a testament to both the heights that consciousness can achieve and the depths to which it can fall when it loses sight of its own essential nature. The ruins of Hallownest stand now as a monument to love and loss, to the terrible price of trying to perfect something that was never meant to be perfected. Every crumbling wall tells a story of beings who reached for something greater than themselves, who dared to dream of order in chaos and paid the ultimate price for that dream. In the deepest chambers of the kingdom, where the void still flows like a river of liquid darkness, new vessels continue to stir. They are the children of an ancient dream, born from the union of consciousness and emptiness, carrying within their hollow shells the potential for both salvation and destruction. Some will awaken to find purpose in service to others, while others will remain forever still, their potential unrealized, but their sacrifice no less meaningful. The White Lady sleeps still in her cocoon of thorns and roots, her consciousness withdrawn from the world that became too painful to bear. But even in her self-imposed exile, she continues to nurture new life, tending to seeds of possibility that may one day bloom into something beautiful and strange. Her dreams, filtered through layers of bark and vine, seep into the soil of Hallownest, ensuring that the kingdom's legacy will endure in forms yet to be imagined. The pale king's consciousness, scattered like stars across the vast expanse of his former realm, continues its eternal work of preservation and instruction. In hidden chambers and secret passages, his knowledge waits to be discovered by those who have the wisdom to learn from both his triumphs and his failures. He has become what he always sought to be, a teacher and guide, helping others to navigate the treacherous waters of consciousness without repeating the mistakes that led to his kingdom's fall. And in the realm of dreams, where all consciousness ultimately converges, the radiance dances still. No longer the desperate, raging goddess who sought to reclaim her lost children through force and infection, she has returned to her original nature as a source of light and inspiration. Her influence flows through the dreams of all thinking beings, reminding them of the beauty and wonder that exists in the wild, chaotic spaces of the unconscious mind. The infection that once threatened to consume all of Hallownest has become something else entirely. Not a plague to be feared, but a reminder of the importance of balance in all things. It serves as a warning against the dangers of suppressing natural consciousness in favour of artificial order, and as a testament to the resilience of the dreaming mind when faced with forces that seek to control or contain it. The night, whether sitting in eternal vigil or having found peace through deeper understanding, represents the possibility of transcendence through sacrifice. Its journey from the depths of the abyss to the heights of conscious choice demonstrates that even beings created to be empty can find meaning and purpose through their own actions and decisions. But perhaps the most important lesson to be drawn from Hallownest's rise and fall is that consciousness itself is not a problem to be solved or a force to be controlled, but a mystery to be celebrated and explored. The Pale King's great error was not in seeking to create order from chaos, but in believing that order and chaos were fundamentally incompatible. The Radiance's tragedy was not in loving her children too much, but in allowing that love to become possessive and destructive when it was threatened. The true wisdom lies in understanding that consciousness, in all its forms, is a gift that should be cherished rather than constrained. The wild dreams of the Radiance and the structure fractured thoughts of the Pale King are both necessary aspects of the greater whole, and any attempt to privilege one over the other will inevitably lead to imbalance and suffering. As you drift towards sleep, carried by the gentle rhythm of this ancient tale, let your mind wander through the empty corridors of Hallow Nest. Feel the weight of history in every stone, the echo of dreams in every shadow, the presence of consciousness in every empty space. Remember that you too are part of this eternal cycle, a thinking being capable of both order and chaos, structure and freedom, rational thought and wild dreams. The kingdom of Hallownest may have fallen, but its legacy lives on in every conscious mind that dares to dream of something greater than itself. In your dreams tonight, you may find yourself walking through those ancient passages, discovering secrets that have been hidden for ages, learning lessons that can only be taught in the language of sleep and shadow. And when you wake, you will carry with you the wisdom of ruins, the understanding that all civilizations rise and fall, that all dreams eventually end, but that the consciousness that creates them is eternal and indestructible. You will know that you are both the dreamer and the dream, the vessel and the void, the light and the darkness that gives it meaning. Sleep well, traveller of the deep places. Let the story of Hallownest carry you into peaceful rest, knowing that in the realm of dreams, all consciousness is one, and all stories eventually lead us home to the truth of what we are, beings of infinite possibility, forever reaching toward the light while remaining rooted in the darkness that gives that light its power to illuminate. In the end, we are all children of the void and servants of the light, hollow vessels filled with the dreams of gods, carrying within our fragile shells the entire history of consciousness itself. And in that carrying, in that eternal vigil between sleeping and waking, we find our purpose and our peace. The tale is told, the kingdom sleeps, and the eternal cycle continues. Rest now, and dream of deeper things.